Imagine living your entire life believing in something so fundamental, so unshakable, only to have it all torn apart by a simple test. That's exactly what happened to Michael and Sarah, a seemingly happy couple with a young daughter, Emma. Their life was picture perfect from the outside, a cozy suburban home, weekend barbecues with friends, and the kind of love story that others envied. But when Sarah, out of sheer curiosity, decided to take an at-home DNA test as part of a family ancestry project, she unknowingly set off a chain of events that would lead to a horrifying discovery, one that would shake her marriage to its core. At first, it seemed harmless, just a fun little experiment to trace her roots and maybe uncover a distant relative or two. But when her results came back, something didn't add up. She noticed inconsistencies, things that made no sense based on what she had always known about her heritage. Confused but intrigued, she convinced Michael to take the test as well, thinking it might clear things up. Instead, the results only deepened the mystery. And then came the real shock: Emma's DNA. It was supposed to confirm what they already knew, to show that she was, without a doubt, their daughter. But the truth printed on that screen was something neither of them were prepared for. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she read the results over and over, hoping she was making a mistake. But numbers don't lie. Science doesn't lie. And what the test revealed about Emma's DNA was impossible to ignore. When she finally showed Michael, expecting him to be just as shocked, just as devastated, his reaction wasn't what she expected. He didn't seem confused. He didn't seem heartbroken. Instead, he just stared at the results in silence, his face unreadable, his fingers tightening around the paper. And then, without a word, he stood up and walked away. Sarah's heart pounded as she watched her husband disappear into the other room. Something was wrong, terribly, terribly wrong. Michael wasn't acting like a man whose entire world had just been turned upside down. He was acting like a man who already knew the truth. And that's when Sarah realized, whatever secret the DNA test had uncovered, Michael had been hiding it all along. But why? And what was he going to do next? Sarah sat frozen, her mind racing with possibilities, none of which made any sense. How could Michael have known? Had he suspected something all along? Was he keeping a secret from her, or was there something even darker lurking beneath the surface? She wanted to call out to him, demand an explanation, but her throat was dry, her voice refusing to cooperate. Instead, she listened as his footsteps echoed down the hallway, the sound of a door creaking open, then closing softly behind him. The silence that followed was suffocating. In the days leading up to this moment, everything had seemed so normal. Michael had been his usual self, waking up early for work, coming home on time, cracking jokes at dinner, and tucking Emma into bed with the same warmth he always had. There had been no signs of unease, no distant looks or suspicious behavior. If anything, their life had been blissfully uneventful. Sarah tried to think back, to pinpoint a moment, a shift, something that could explain why her husband wasn't reacting like a man blindsided by a revelation, but nothing stood out. And that was the most unsettling part. It wasn't that Michael had changed after seeing the results. It was that he hadn't. A wave of unease settled in her chest as she thought about the past few months. There had been a few odd moments, things she had brushed off as nothing. A phone call Michael had quickly ended when she walked into the room. A strange look between him and his mother at a family gathering that she had barely noticed at the time. The night he had come home late, reeking of whiskey, his face pale and drawn, muttering something about needing to clear his head. None of it had seemed significant before, but now every little thing took on a new weight. She reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over the call button. Should she call him? Or should she wait? A part of her feared that if she confronted him too soon, she might push him into silence. She needed answers, but she needed them the right way. As she sat there, trying to piece together the fragments of the past. Another thought crept into her mind, one that sent a shiver down her spine. What if Michael wasn't the only one who knew? What if someone else had been keeping this secret, someone even closer than she realized? She thought of her mother-in-law, a woman who had always been kind but guarded, never one to overshare. She thought of Michael's best friend, Tom, who had seemed oddly tense the last time they had all been together. Even her own sister had made a strange comment a few weeks ago, something about how family isn't always what it seems. At the time, Sarah had laughed it off. Now, she wasn't so sure. Her breathing quickened as she stared at the DNA results in her lap. The truth was right in front of her, and yet it felt like she was still completely in the dark. If Michael had known, how long had he known? And why had he kept it from her? More importantly, who else had been keeping this secret? As she sat there, lost in thought, she heard a noise. The front door. Her heart pounded as she realized Michael was back. But this time, something was different. The way he stood in the doorway, the way his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity she had never seen before. He wasn't coming back with an apology or an explanation. He was coming back with something else entirely. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as Michael stepped inside, his movements slow, deliberate. He was watching her too closely, as if measuring her reaction, calculating his next move. For a split second, she thought about pretending everything was fine, maybe even tucking the DNA results away, acting like she hadn't seen them. But it was too late for that. They both knew the truth was out. She gripped the paper in her hand, feeling the edges crinkle beneath her tightening fingers. "Michael," she finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's going on?" But before he could answer, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He hesitated, glancing at the screen, and in that moment, Sarah saw something flicker across his face, something that made her stomach twist. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't confusion. It was something closer to fear. Without a word, he silenced the call and shoved the phone back into his pocket. "We need to talk," he said, his voice eerily calm. But before he could say more, there was a loud knock at the door. Sarah jumped. It was too late for visitors. Michael's jaw clenched as he turned toward the sound, his entire posture stiffening. Sarah hesitated before moving toward the door, but Michael grabbed her wrist, his grip firm. "Don't," he muttered under his breath. The knock came again, harder this time. Whoever was outside wasn't going away. Sarah's pulse pounded as she glanced at her husband. The look in his eyes sent a chill down her spine. He knew exactly who it was, and he didn't want her to open that door. For a moment, everything felt suspended in time. Then, just as she was about to pull away from Michael's grasp, her phone vibrated on the table. A text message. She snatched it up, her hands trembling as she read the words on the screen. "Stop asking questions. You don't want to know the truth." Her mouth went dry. No name, no number. Just a warning. A threat. She looked up at Michael, her heart pounding. "Who is this?" she demanded, holding up the phone. But he didn't answer. Instead, he let go of her wrist and took a step back, his face pale, his expression unreadable. "Sarah," he said quietly, "just let it go." Let it go. How could she? Someone was trying to stop her from digging deeper. Someone who knew more than she did. And Michael, her own husband, was telling her to drop it. That only meant one thing. Whatever this was, it was bigger than she had imagined. She ignored his plea and moved toward the door, her fingers gripping the handle. But just as she turned it, she heard something that made her freeze. The distinct sound of a car engine roaring to life, tires screeching against the pavement. She yanked the door open just in time to see taillights disappearing down the street, swallowed by the darkness. Whoever had come to warn her was already gone, but that only confirmed what she already knew: someone was watching, and they were afraid of what she might uncover. Sarah stood in the doorway, staring at the empty street, her pulse thudding in her ears. The red taillights had vanished into the darkness, but the weight of what just happened lingered heavy in the air. Someone had been here watching, waiting only to leave the moment she got too close. The warning text still glowed on her phone screen, taunting her. But before she could even begin to process what it meant, another vibration startled her hand. A second message. But this time, it wasn't for her. She turned, realizing Michael's phone was buzzing in his pocket again. He hesitated before pulling it out, his grip tightening around the device as he read whatever was on the screen. Sarah watched as his face paled even further, his breathing shallow. He swallowed hard and turned away, as if shielding the screen from her. That was it. That was the final straw. "Michael, what's going on?" she demanded, stepping closer. "Who's texting you?" But before he could answer, another phone rang. Not hers. Not Michael's. It was coming from inside the house from the kitchen. The landline. Sarah hadn't even realized they still had it connected. Her blood ran cold as she moved toward the ringing phone, every step feeling heavier than the last. She glanced back at Michael, but he didn't move. Now, she wasn't so sure. Her breathing quickened as she stared at the DNA results in her lap. The truth was right in front of her, and yet it felt like she was still completely in the dark. If Michael had known, how long had he known? And why had he kept it from her? More importantly, who else had been keeping this secret? As she sat there, lost in thought, she heard a noise. The front door. Her heart pounded as she realized Michael was back. But this time, something was different. The way he stood in the doorway, the way his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity she had never seen before. He wasn't coming back with an apology or an explanation. He was coming back with something else entirely. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as Michael stepped inside, his movements slow, deliberate. He was watching her too closely, as if measuring her reaction, calculating his next move. For a split second, she thought about pretending everything was fine, maybe even tucking the DNA results away, acting like she hadn't seen them. But it was too late for that. They both knew the truth was out. She gripped the paper in her hand, feeling the edges crinkle beneath her tightening fingers. "Michael," she finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's going on?" But before he could answer, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He hesitated, glancing at the screen, and in that moment, Sarah saw something flicker across his face. Something that made her stomach twist. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't confusion. It was something closer to fear. Without a word, he silenced the call and shoved the phone back into his pocket. "We need to talk," he said, his voice eerily calm. But before he could say more, there was a loud knock at the door. Sarah jumped. It was late, too late for visitors. Michael's jaw clenched as he turned toward the sound, his entire posture stiffening. Sarah hesitated before moving toward the door, but Michael grabbed her wrist, his grip firm. "Don't," he muttered under his breath. The knock came again, harder this time. Whoever was outside wasn't going away. Sarah's pulse pounded as she glanced at her husband. The look in his eyes sent a chill down her spine. He knew exactly who it was, and he didn't want her to open that door. For a moment, everything felt suspended in time. Then, just as she was about to pull away from Michael's grasp, her phone vibrated on the table. A text message. She snatched it up, her hands trembling as she read the words on the screen. "Stop asking questions. You don't want to know the truth." Her mouth went dry. No name, no number. Just a warning. A threat. She looked up at Michael, her heart pounding. "Who is this?" she demanded, holding up the phone. But he didn't answer. Instead, he let go of her wrist and took a step back, his face pale, his expression unreadable. "Sarah," he said quietly, "just let it go. Let it go." How could she? Someone was trying to stop her from digging deeper. Someone who knew more than she did. And Michael, her own husband, was telling her to drop it. That only meant one thing. Whatever this was, it was bigger than she had imagined. She ignored his plea and moved toward the door, her fingers gripping the handle. But just as she turned it, she heard something that made her freeze. The distinct sound of a car engine roaring to life, tires screeching against the pavement. She yanked the door open just in time to see taillights disappearing down the street, swallowed by the darkness. Whoever had come to warn her was already gone. But that only confirmed what she already knew: someone was watching. And they were afraid of what she might uncover. Sarah stood in the doorway, staring at the empty street, her pulse thudding in her ears. The red taillights had vanished into the darkness, but the weight of what just happened lingered heavy in the air. Someone had been here watching, waiting only to leave the moment she got too close. The warning text still glowed on her phone screen, taunting her. But before she could even begin to process what it meant, another vibration startled her hand. A second message. But this time, it wasn't for her. She turned, realizing Michael's phone was buzzing in his pocket again. He hesitated before pulling it out, his grip tightening around the device as he read whatever was on the screen. Sarah watched as his face paled even further, his breathing shallow. He swallowed hard and turned away, as if shielding the screen from her. That was it. That was the final straw. "Michael, what's going on?" she demanded, stepping closer. "Who's texting you?" But before he could answer, another phone rang. Not hers. Not Michael's. It was coming from inside the house, from the kitchen. The landline. Sarah hadn't even realized they still had it connected. Her blood ran cold as she moved toward the ringing phone, every step feeling heavier than the last. She glanced back at Michael, but he didn't move. He just stood there, rigid, staring at the floor, as if he already knew what was coming. She picked up the receiver, pressing it to her ear, her voice barely steady. "Hello?" Silence. A crackle of static. Then, a voice. Distorted. Low. Almost robotic. "You were never supposed to know." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" she whispered. A pause. Then, the line went dead. The dial tone buzzed in her ear, but she couldn't move. The room felt colder, smaller, like the walls were closing in. She turned back to Michael, but he wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the DNA test still clutched in her other hand. "Sarah," he finally said, his voice barely audible. "We need to leave." Now? But before she could even process his words, her phone vibrated again. Another text, this time from an unknown number. "Your sister is next." Her stomach dropped. She felt the blood drain from her face. Her sister? What did she have to do with any of this? Panic surged through her veins as she scrambled to dial her number, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped the phone. It rang once. Twice. No answer. She tried again, her breath coming in quick, uneven gasps. Still nothing. The silence on the other end was more terrifying than anything else. Michael grabbed her arm, his grip firm but urgent. "Sarah, listen to me," he said, his voice more serious than she had ever heard it. "Whatever this is, it's bigger than us. We have to go. Right now." But Sarah couldn't move. The messages, the warnings, the disappearing car. And now, her sister roped into this nightmare, for reasons she didn't understand. A horrible thought crept into her mind, one she didn't want to believe, but couldn't ignore. What if this wasn't about Emma's DNA at all? What if this had nothing to do with her daughter? What if this secret ran deeper, far deeper than she ever could have imagined? Her legs felt weak as the weight of it all crashed down on her. Someone was trying to keep the truth buried. Someone was willing to threaten her, her family, even her sister, to make sure she stopped asking questions. But she wasn't going to stop. She couldn't. Because now, she wasn't just searching for answers. She was racing against something much more terrifying: time. Sarah's hands trembled as she clutched the phone, the screen glowing in the dim light of the hallway. The message about her sister was still there, staring back at her like a ticking bomb. But it wasn't just words, it was a warning. A promise of something worse. She could feel it now, the weight of it pressing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. Somewhere out there, someone was watching. Someone was waiting. And whoever they weren't bluffing. She turned to Michael, her voice breaking. "We have to go to my sister's. Now?" Michael hesitated, his jaw clenched tight. "Sarah, we can't just—" But she didn't let him finish. She was already moving, grabbing her coat, keys, whatever she could find. Logic didn't matter anymore. Fear had taken over, raw and unrelenting. She stormed toward the door, but as she reached for the handle, something made her freeze. A shadow moved across the front window. Her heart slammed against her ribs. It was fast, just a flicker, gone in a second, but she knew what she saw. Someone was outside, watching, waiting. The silence in the house suddenly felt suffocating. Every second stretched too long, the stillness thick with something unspoken. Slowly, she took a step back, her breath shallow, eyes locked on the window. Michael must have seen it too, because he moved toward her, his voice low. "Sarah, step away from the door." Her fingers curled around her phone, her mind racing. "Call the cops." No. Whoever this was, they wouldn't just stand there waiting to be caught. They were trying to make her afraid. And it was working. Then, the doorknob moved. Sarah sucked in a sharp breath, stumbling backward as Michael pulled her behind him. The air felt electric, charged with something dangerous, something neither of them understood. They waited, frozen, but no one knocked. No one spoke. Just the soft creak of the doorknob twisting, testing. Then, silence. A second later, the porch light flickered out. They rushed through the kitchen, Michael shoving open the back door, scanning the yard before pulling Sarah out behind him. The night air was thick and cold, pressing against her skin as they moved quickly toward the car. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fit them into the lock. Then, from somewhere in the distance, a phone rang. Not hers. Not Michael's. The sound came from the shadows just beyond the driveway. Sarah's breath hitched as she whipped her head around, eyes searching the darkness. The ringing continued, loud and clear, cutting through the silence like a blade. Someone was standing there, just out of sight, watching, listening, and waiting for them to make their next move. The phone stopped ringing. A long, suffocating silence followed. Then, a voice. Low, cold, too close. "You shouldn't have looked." Sarah's stomach dropped. The air around her seemed to close in. And in that moment, she knew this wasn't just a warning anymore. This was a hunt. The night felt suffocating, pressing down on Sarah like an unseen weight as she stood frozen, heart hammering against her ribs. The words still lingered in the air. You shouldn't have looked. Whoever had spoken was no longer just a shadow in the dark. They were real, they were close, and they knew exactly what she had done. But before she could react, Michael grabbed her arm and yanked her toward the car. His grip was unyielding, his urgency unlike anything she had ever seen. "Get in," he ordered, his voice sharp, leaving no room for argument. Sarah barely had time to process before she was shoved into the passenger seat, the car roaring to life as Michael threw it into reverse and tore down the street, tires screeching against the pavement. The silence between them was thick, nearly unbearable. Sarah could feel the questions clawing at her throat, but she was afraid of the answers. Who was that, outside their house? Why did they call? What did they mean? But most importantly, why did Michael react like this? She turned to him, studying the tightness in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the wheel like he was bracing for impact. He wasn't just afraid. He was hiding something. Her mind raced back through everything that had happened. The DNA test. The messages. The shadow outside. The flickering porch light. Something wasn't adding up. And then it hit her. Michael knew they were coming. The second she got that message about her sister, he told her they had to leave. He didn't hesitate, didn't ask questions. He just knew. Her stomach twisted, a cold realization settling over her like a fog. "Michael," she said slowly, barely recognizing the sound of her own voice. "Who were you texting earlier?" His knuckles turned white against the steering wheel. "Sarah, don't." "Don't what?" She cut in, her voice rising. "Ask questions? Keep pretending I don't see what's right in front of me. You've been acting weird since I opened that test, and now someone is threatening my family, and you just happen to know exactly when to run? What the hell is going on?" Michael exhaled sharply, his hands tightening, his face unreadable. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. The streetlights flashed past in streaks of yellow and white, illuminating his face in brief flickers of light and shadow. And then, finally, he spoke. "You were never supposed to take that test." The words landed like a punch to the gut. Sarah felt her whole body go cold. "What?" she whispered. Michael's eyes stayed on the road, his expression dark, unreadable. "That test, those results, you weren't supposed to see them," he repeated, his voice eerily calm. "Because the truth isn't what you think it is." Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't just about Emma's DNA anymore. This wasn't just about some mistake in a lab. This was bigger. Much bigger. She tried to steady her breath, but panic clawed at her chest. "Then tell me," she demanded. "Tell me the truth." Michael swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he finally said it. "Emma isn't our daughter." The world seemed to stop. Sarah's breath hitched. The sound of the tires against the road blurred into static. "What are you talking about?" She choked out. "Of course she's our daughter. But then, she remembered the test. The results that had made no sense. The blood that didn't match. The numbers that had shattered everything she thought she knew. Sarah's mind spiraled as Michael's words echoed inside her head. "Emma isn't our daughter. She never was." The weight of it pressed down on her chest, suffocating, crushing. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. But the DNA test, the cold, unshakable science, had already told her something was wrong. And now, Michael was confirming it. But how? How could Emma not be theirs? How could they have raised her, loved her, held her in their arms since the day she was born, only to find out she wasn't theirs at all? Her hands clenched into fists, nails digging into her palms, as she turned sharply toward Michael. "What did you do?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the accusation was there, raw and burning. "Tell me the truth, Michael. Right now." Michael's jaw tightened, his grip on the steering wheel unyielding. He was silent for a long time, the road stretching endlessly in front of them, a dark tunnel with no way out. Then finally, his voice broke the unbearable quiet. "I tried to stop this," he murmured. "I tried to make sure you never found out." Sarah's breath hitched, her stomach twisting violently. "You knew? You knew all along?" She could barely get the words out. The betrayal was suffocating, like a hand closing around her throat. "Michael, what did you do?" The car suddenly swerved, tires screeching as he pulled onto a deserted side road, gravel crunching beneath them. He threw it into park and turned to her, his face shadowed in the dim light. "I need you to listen to me," he said, voice thick with something unreadable. "I need you to trust me, Sarah." She let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "Trust you? Trust you? After you just admitted you've been lying to me for how long, Michael? How long have you known our daughter isn't ours?" Her voice cracked on the last word, the pain unbearable. Michael exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Since the day she was born," he admitted. Sarah recoiled as if he had struck her. Her mind couldn't process it, couldn't accept it. "That's impossible," she whispered, shaking her head. "I was there. I gave birth to her." Michael's eyes darkened. "You gave birth that night," he said slowly. "But Sarah, you didn't bring home the baby you gave birth to." The world tilted violently. A cold numbness spread through her limbs. "What are you saying?" she choked out, her entire body trembling. Michael swallowed hard, his expression raw with something that almost looked like guilt. "Emma was switched at birth," he said, "on purpose." A strangled sound escaped Sarah's throat. She felt like she couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "Switched? On purpose? That doesn't make sense," she whispered. "Why? Why would someone do that?" Michael hesitated, and that hesitation sent another surge of panic through her. "Because," he finally said, his voice hollow, "she wasn't supposed to exist." Sarah's entire body locked up. The words didn't fit. They didn't make sense. "What do you mean she wasn't supposed to exist?" she demanded, but Michael was already shaking his head. "I don't have all the answers," he said, his voice tight. "But I know this: whoever did this, they're still watching. They never stopped. And now that you found out the truth, they won't let us walk away." Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. Every part of her wanted to scream, to cry, to do something, but the horror of it all kept her frozen. If what Michael was saying was true, if Emma had been switched on purpose, it meant their entire life had been built on a lie. It meant someone had orchestrated everything from the very beginning. And worse, it meant someone was still controlling it. A sharp buzz rattled against the console. Sarah flinched, her heart leaping into her throat. Another text. She reached for her phone with shaking hands, her stomach twisting as she read the message. "Choose the truth or your family. This is your only warning." A chill ran down her spine. She looked up at Michael, but he was already staring at the screen, his expression unreadable. "They were never going to let you walk away from this," he murmured. Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the phone tighter. The choice was clear, brutal in its simplicity. She could bury the truth, pretend she never saw the DNA test, never questioned anything, and maybe, just maybe, they could keep their family safe. Or she could keep pushing, keep digging, and risk losing everything. She turned to Michael, but he wasn't looking at her. He was staring straight ahead, shoulders tense, fists clenched against his knees. He already knew. He had been expecting this. Her pulse pounded, blood roaring in her ears, as realization slammed into her like a freight train. "You knew this was coming," she whispered. "You've known this whole time." Michael's eyes closed for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Sarah to see it, the guilt, the resignation, the fear. When he opened them again, they were unreadable, distant. "I tried to protect you," he murmured. Sarah's stomach lurched. "Protect me?" she echoed, her voice shaking. "By lying to me? By letting me believe our daughter was ours? By hiding this from me?" Her voice cracked, the betrayal cutting deeper than she thought possible. Michael exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, his entire body coiled like a spring, about to snap. "It's not just us, Sarah," he said finally, his voice low, urgent. "This goes deeper than you could ever imagine." Something inside her shattered. "Then tell me," she demanded. "No more lies. No more protecting me. Tell me what the hell is going on." Michael hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the road, the empty darkness stretching in all directions. And then, finally, he spoke. "Emma was never supposed to be part of this family," he admitted. "But neither were you." Sarah felt the world tilt, her breath catching in her throat. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, barely able to form the words. Michael swallowed hard, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "This didn't start with Emma," he said. "It started with you, and your real parents." Sarah's mind blanked. My real what? You were adopted, Sarah, Michael said, his voice pained. But not through normal means. Not legally. Not the way you think. Her body went cold. No, she said automatically, shaking her head. That's not possible. My parents. They weren't supposed to have you, Michael interrupted. They took you, Sarah. From them. And they've spent decades looking for you. The words didn't make sense. They felt foreign, like someone else's nightmare. Who? She choked out. Who took me? And who's looking for me? Michael's expression was raw, tortured. The people who sent that message, he said. The people who switched Emma. The people who have been watching you your entire life. Sarah's breath came in short, uneven gasps. This wasn't just about Emma. It had never just been about Emma. It had been about her. Her entire life had been a lie, manipulated, controlled by people she didn't even know existed. And now they had finally found her. A sharp knock at the car window made her jump violently. Her blood ran ice cold as she turned her head. A man stood outside, dressed in black, face partially obscured by the shadows. But Sarah didn't need to see his face to know he wasn't a stranger. He had been following them. He had been waiting. Michael's body went rigid, his hands flexing as he reached for something under his seat. Don't open the door, he said through gritted teeth. But Sarah couldn't move. She could barely breathe. The man lifted his hand and pressed something against the glass. A photograph. Sarah's stomach dropped. It was old, yellowed at the edges, but she recognized the faces instantly. A baby. And a woman. A woman who looked exactly like her. Her mother. But not the woman who raised her. Not the woman she had called Mom her whole life. The man tapped the glass twice, slow and deliberate, then mouthed two words that sent ice through her veins. Come home. And just like that, Sarah realized the truth. She wasn't running from strangers. She was running from her own family. Sarah's entire body went numb as she stared at the photograph pressed against the glass. The baby, the woman her mother. The real one. The one she had never met. The one she had unknowingly spent her entire life running from. Her breath caught in her throat as the man outside the car mouthed those two terrifying words again. Come home. But the second he moved, the man outside turned his head slightly, and Sarah caught sight of the dark SUV parked just down the road. She wasn't sure how she had missed it before. The back door was open, and standing there, in the dim glow of the headlights, was a woman. Sarah's heart nearly stopped. The woman was older, but there was no mistaking it. She was the woman in the photograph. Her mother. Her real mother. Her knees nearly buckled. Nothing made sense. Why was she here? Why now? Why had she done this to Emma, to her? A million questions swirled inside her head, but before she could process any of them, the woman took a slow, deliberate step forward. Sarah, she called, her voice eerily calm. Put the gun down, Michael. You know you won't use it. Michael's grip didn't waver. Stay back, he warned, his voice deadly. I swear to God, I will. No, you won't, the woman interrupted, tilting her head slightly. Because if you pull that trigger, you'll never get the truth. Silence. Thick, suffocating silence. Sarah's pulse pounded. The truth. That's what this was all about. It had always been about the truth. But now, standing on the edge of it, she wasn't sure she wanted to hear it. The woman took another step forward, eyes locked on Sarah. They told you a story, didn't they? She murmured. That your parents adopted you. That you were loved. That you were safe. Her lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. But tell me, Sarah, did it ever feel real? Did you ever truly belong? Sarah felt something inside her crack wide open. No. The answer was no. She had always felt like an outsider, always had a nagging feeling that something was missing. She had buried it, ignored it, convinced herself it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It had been this. Michael's voice cut through the fog. "She's lying," he spat. "She doesn't care about you, Sarah. She never did. She switched your baby." The woman finished smoothly, eyes still locked on Sarah's. "Yes, Michael, I did. And I'd do it again." Sarah inhaled sharply, stomach twisting violently. "Why?" she choked out. "Why would you do that? Why would you take Emma?" The woman exhaled, her expression unreadable. "Because she isn't yours, Sarah. She never was. She's one of us." The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine. One of us. A sudden, horrifying thought crashed into her. The tests. The threats. The warnings. It had never been about her. It had been about Emma. Michael shifted beside her, his body coiled like a spring. "Sarah," he said lowly, urgently, "we need to go. Now." But Sarah couldn't move. "You're lying," she whispered. "You're trying to manipulate me." The woman shook her head, slow and deliberate. "Then tell me, Sarah," she said, "why did the DNA test say Emma isn't your daughter?" Sarah's breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. She wanted to scream, to fight, but deep down, something inside her already knew the answer. Emma wasn't hers because she had never been meant to be hers. The woman extended the key toward her. "Come with me, Sarah. Find out the truth, or keep running and live in a lie." Sarah's entire world hung in the balance. Everything led to this moment. She could feel Michael watching her, feel his silent plea for her to turn away, to leave, to run. But the pull was too strong. She had spent her life searching for the missing pieces, and now they were right in front of her. Michael reached for her arm, his grip firm but desperate. "Sarah, don't do this," he murmured.